Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and in this video I shall be elucidating why the United Kingdom should not pay reparations to India, and the reasons are manifold. You may have seen a speech that Dr. Shashi Tharoor delivered at the Oxford Union Society about 3 years ago, and I've seen the learned doctor address that chamber on a previous occasion, and this oration, as most of his, are droll and emotive. So here I am speaking to you in English. I'm Irish, and the English language is derived from French and Anglo-Saxon, and French in turn is derived from Latin, and Latin has roots in ancient Greek, and I don't know where that has roots in. Are these all examples of colonialism? It's possible that they are. But it reminds me how colonialism did not start with the foundation of the Honourable East India Company on the 31st of December 1600. Colonialism goes back as long as recorded history is there. We have recorded history for around 5,000 years. That's when the first people started to write in Mesopotamia, what we now call Iraq. I don't know of many countries that have ever paid reparations for colonialism. I know Italy paid them to Libya, but that was solely in order to get sweetheart deals for the Prime Minister of Italy's business, Silvio Berlusconi. But he didn't notably pay them to Italy's other former colonies, for instance, Somalia or Ethiopia, that was briefly ruled. For that matter, Italy, being a successor state of the Roman Empire, should she pay reparations to almost every country around the Mediterranean? Well, the Vatican City is a successor state of the Roman Empire. The Pope, he still has the title Pontiff, derived from Pontifex Maximus, as in the big bridge builder, which is a title of some of the high officials in ancient Rome. So having the UK pay reparations because of the British Raj would be unjust for several reasons, which I will now outline. The British Raj was created largely by agreement. Indian rulers choosing to accede to the British Raj, which allowed them to be internally independent, but their foreign affairs were handled by the United Kingdom. Now, this wasn't a loss for these Indian princely states, since they often didn't have foreign relations outside of India anyway. The British saying you can't have a diplomatic relationship with Spain or Denmark or China, whoever it may be, we will handle that for you. And as almost all these princely states didn't have diplomatic relations with those other faraway countries, they were not giving up anything that they had already. Now, there were a few cases of outright invasion, such as in Sindh. It's difficult to generalize about the establishment of the British Raj because it took place over something like 350 years. I don't want to tell the whole story, but from 1600, simply doing commerce, purchasing land, trading posts. India was somewhat anarchic, and having the East India Company setting up its own army to protect its trading posts and merchants, and then gradually buying more land and getting into owning land as a money-making scheme and renting it out and growing things, and eventually sometimes annexing land. Sindh was outright invaded, that's true. There are other princely states such as Cooch Behar, where the king sent delegates to the British asking for their protection. Could he come into the British Raj and so forth? So yes, sometimes it's by annexation, which is how countries were created at the time. How were these princely states created? How was the Mughal Empire created? Founded in 1527 and declined in the 18th century, and after the India Mutiny of 1857, finally extirpated. So there was no notion of national self-determination back then, not till January 1918, when President Woodrow Wilson of the USA propounded that notion, a notion which is still not fully accepted. Incidentally, ethnic minorities in India who wish to secede are not permitted to secede. I'm not saying it's wrong, but if one really believes in national self-determination, one must allow all sorts of groups to break away. So the Raj was enormously beneficial to India. I know there was a bad side to it too, but it's not my job to tell that side of the story. The other side are tasked with drawing attention to that. So in terms of science, technology, trade and order, the Raj did a lot for India. Now, there have been times when India had been streets ahead of the UK in terms of technology and science, have been light years ahead in regard to human rights. You can think about the Emperor Ashoka, who abolished slavery and all the rest of it, and all that is estimable. However, India had fallen behind, and the UK had overtaken India, which is why the United Kingdom was able to be mightier. So Dr. Tharoor, he spoke about how much world trade India had in the 18th century, prior to the Britannic forces establishing control over Hindustan. And then he looked at how much world trade India had by the time of independence in 1947, when Dr. Tharoor was minus 12. But that doesn't mean that the UK caused a decline in trade, that it hasn't demonstrated any cause and effect relationship. I doubt the accuracy of these 18th century statistics. How were they able to capture this data? In the 18th century, much of Africa hardly traded with the outside world, apart from the slave trade. Colonialism brought Africa into the global economy. Some of it was an evil aspect of the global economy. It's almost as though the erudite doctor had not heard of the transport revolution, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and so on. All these leaps forward in science and technology, which allowed the UK to gain a much greater market share of world trade. And these breakthroughs made it possible for Western lands to race ahead whilst Asian countries lagged behind. So, as I pointed out, India was very advanced and civilized when Europe was in the Dark Ages. So civilization is not an absolute, something that one has or doesn't. There are levels of civilization. And of course, one could be very far ahead in terms of technology, but very far behind in human rights, and vice versa. Motilal Nehru, the one-time leader of the Congress Party, he acknowledged that in his time that the Indians had fallen pretty low and deserved what they got. That's a direct quotation from his son, Jawaharlal Nehru, in his autobiography. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, almost all scientific inventions and discoveries were in the Occident. France, Germany, the USA, and particularly the United Kingdom, the UK being the first country to industrialize, only overtaken by the USA in the 1870s and Germany in the 1890s. And India made almost no advances of her own at this time. They were brought to her by the United Kingdom. So there was a charitable aspect of British Empire, but some of it was about hard-headed profit and loss. We could compare India's advancement to that of countries which were not colonized, such as Nepal and Bhutan. So they were mountainous and faced developmental challenges. The standard of their infrastructure was much behind India in 1847, even allowing for their hilly topography. So people who rail against the British Empire often excoriate the Raj for having laws against sedition, but these were still on the statute book, certainly in the 1970s. And look what Indira Gandhi did when she's caught cheating in elections, locking people up willy-nilly just by her fiat. So Dr. Tharoor's own Congress party invoked a lot of this colonial era legislation when it was necessary. So the Raj was just overall, and the main proof of this is that the system of justice has remained largely unchanged. Imitation is flattery. There's been one retrograde step, which is getting rid of trial by jury. If the Raj was so unjust, then the system of criminal justice would be overhauled. But even Indian nationalists have chosen not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We look at Dadabhai Naoroji, the first Indian elected to the British Parliament. This Farsi gentleman from Mumbai, was then Bombay, said that India did owe the UK much for the advantages which she gained from being colonised. He also said that much money was leaving India in terms of pensions paid to Britishers who retired to the old country. Now, Dr. Tharoor, he alluded to the Bengal Famine, which indeed was ghastliness on a gigantic scale. Something of the order of 3 million people perished. Was absolutely horrendous, no question about it. It's difficult for me to even imagine seeing someone starving to death. Now, it could not have been avoided entirely, but it could have been reduced significantly. Famines did not start with the British Raj. Famines are there throughout recorded history in India and everywhere else. The Raj did much to lessen the frequency and the severity of such calamities. The Congress Party must bear their share of responsibility for doing their uttermost to obstruct the government. They may have wanted a cataclysm in Bengal because it would redound to the advantage of their Quit India movement. With any crime we ask, cui bono, who benefits? Not that this was exactly a crime. So Congress was sabotaging railways, preaching non-cooperation, and bizarrely did, so far as I can tell, nothing to protest about this completely deplorable situation in Bengal. Bridges had been destroyed by the Raj because the Japanese were advancing on the eastern frontier of India. They didn't want to help the Nipponese in penetrating India, which is, anyway, this is why transporting emergency foodstuffs was made so much more difficult because of this headache. If Congress had been behind the war effort, at least not trying to thwart the government's efforts, then many lives would have been saved. So much famine relief work had been done beforehand. There was a famine relief government department, and new agricultural techniques and fertilizer had been introduced, and scientific studies been done about how to maximize crop yields, and improved transport had done much to save lives during previous droughts, floods, crop failures, and so forth. Irrigation canals have been dug, things of that nature. What else was I going to say? So yes, it's still a blot on the UK's war record that food was not shipped to India. More could have been done to save lives. I acknowledge that. But if the UK was so horrific to Indians, why did so many Indians want to come to independence and keep coming still? The UK has to struggle to keep out those who come illegally. Many come legally. The Indian community in the UK is about 4% of the population and growing rapidly. It would be a lot higher if there were no restrictions on who could come in. And I know Indians have moved to other places like Canada and USA in significant numbers. And the Indian community in the UK is very affluent. If you break down the UK by religious community, the Sikhs are the second richest group. About a third of the British Indian community are Sikh for some reason. Anyway, I'm going to stop this video now because it's getting too long.